Greetings and welcome to the Cerebral Women Art Talks podcast. I'm Phyllis Hollis, your host. As an extension of my Instagram page, Cerebral Women, this podcast offers insights into the visual art world. I interview artists, mainly artists of color and female artists who will freely articulate what inspires their creativity. In addition, you'll hear interesting perspectives from dedicated art professionals who work with artists and the art institutions that feature them. I'm confident that collectively, these individuals will indeed stimulate your mind as they do our eyes. Please know these interviews are conducted in my Manhattan apartment, so please forgive the background sounds of city life. Welcome to the Cerebral Women Art Talks podcast. This episode features Brooklyn-based abstract painter Kemar Keanu Wynter. He holds a BFA from the SUNY Purchase School of Art and Design. Kemar has shown in several group exhibitions in the United States and internationally. His work was the focus of solo exhibitions at Klaus von Nichtssagend Gallery in New York in both 2023 and 2024, in Lisbon, Portugal in 2023, and in Queens, New York in 2021. Kemar was a member of the 2023-24 Sharpe-Walentas Studio Program and has been in residence at the AAI-LES Studio Program, the Macedonia Institute, Anderson Ranch Arts Center, and the Art Quarter Budapest in Hungary, to name a few. His work is held in the collection of the art galleries at Black Studies at the University of Texas, Austin. Kemar's practice has been written about in Hyperallergic, Bon Appetit, and the Brooklyn Rail, and discussed on Correspondence Archive and Montez Press Radio. Please visit Cerebral Women for his expanded bio and enjoy this episode featuring Kemar Keanu Wynter. Welcome, Kemar, to my Cerebral Women Art Talks podcast. I am excited about sharing your voice and your work with my listeners.
Thank you so much for having me, Phyllis. It's an honor to be here, be able to, share this time to have this back and forth with you.
Share with us, when did you discover your artistic passion?
That's an interesting thing. I would say that I was definitely one of those kids in grade school that was known for being the artsy kid. Whenever we would have through projects, there would always be a sort of bidding war for me. I would be the person to do all of the diagrams and all of the illustrations for projects, which I feel made life a lot easier for me. But it was always a thing that I did on my free time. I'm also an only child in a very large family. So drawing was always the way that I got into the sort of creative side of things. Though it had never really occurred to me that it could be something that would really be a feasible passion until I would say high school, but not by way of drawing. It was actually by way of photography. I actually took my, first photography class in sophomore year. And my high school teacher, Mr. Halali, he recommended me to take Teen Academy courses at the International Center of Photography, ICP. And I took my first class there, and that first class eventually turned into a sort of 3-year-long sort of love affair with that institution. And that was where I built my portfolio to actually go to college. So, yeah, I would say that my artistic passions and my artistic pursuits really came out of a photography background rather than, me doodling and illustrating as a grade schooler. So yeah, it's an interesting trajectory to have been on looking back in hindsight.
And when did you realize that you enjoyed painting more? And when did you lean into abstraction versus figurative work?
I would say that I actually have always been more drawn to abstraction. Figuration is one of those things that I can do it, but it has never really been the thing that excites me. Abstraction, I feel resonates with me because I feel it serves as a surrogate to talk about people rather than it being this sort of literal one-to-one thing of I paint the figure and this is about a specific person or about a specific moment with this individual. Yeah, I think that within my practice, I'm able to communicate all of these moments and all of these sort of vignettes of like my life and my relationships to my loved ones, to my environment, to myself, without it directly being about depicting the body or like depicting like people in space, you know? My path into painting was actually kind of a funny one. So like I had said, I got into undergrad through a photography background. But once I was there, I just completely had fallen out of love with it. You know, heading into undergrad, I actually lost about 2 years worth of negatives. And I think that like that massive loss of, you know, all of this like previous like archive of like this sort of practice in development allowed me to disconnect from photography in a way. I felt like less tethered to it. So I actually transferred out of photography in my first year and transitioned into printmaking because it was the next closest thing. And I knew that like within my own interests with drawing and whatnot, that felt like a really natural sort of continuum. While in printmaking, I actually took my first painting class with Matt Bollinger. And Matt, he was unrelenting as a painting professor. He expected a lot from us and like really wanted us to build up the physical skills, the sort of formal skills, the techniques that needed to be a good painter. And for me, I had actually never painted prior to that painting one class. You know, I'd always seen and thought of myself as being like really heavy-handed and had this idea in my mind that I needed to be like one of the old masters. And that just like was not the thing that I was capable of doing per se, just in terms of like touch. So I carried that through, I would say, the first half of that painting one class, and it ended up being like quite a struggle at times. And it was just like a really sort of rigorous course, but there was something that was so thrilling about having that time in that class. And like really, I was really drawn to the difficulty of it. And so I found once I got to the end of that semester, I was agonizing to a degree, but it was also one of those things where like I went from being an awful painter because, you know, I'm starting from zero to being a not too shabby painter. And I decided that this was the thing that I needed to do. And this is the thing that like I wanted to follow. In a way, I feel like I'm always drawn to the crucible of like learning new skills, learning new techniques, learning new processes. And I think that like that desire to be something of a technician and also to in some ways prove that I can accomplish a thing has been a really important battery in terms of keeping my practice going. Just like that desire to keep yearning and keep learning and keep striving for what I'm after.
So if you hadn't realized that you are indeed a painter, right? When you were going through that struggle, did you ever think about a different career path? Is there another career you would have taken?
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, I racked my brain for quite a bit in terms of like deciding that I wanted to fully commit to like pursuing art. Prior to that, I had two other paths that I felt really confident about. One of them was going into culinary arts and becoming a chef. Mm-hmm. And the other was actually going into organic chemistry. Culinary arts always made sense to me because, you know, I come from a large Jamaican family. I grew up doing Friday night dinners with, you know, 20 plus people in the household. And like, it was those Friday night dinners where I learned to cook, where like my passion for cuisine and passion for like being able to like make dishes for people and seeing the ways that like, you know, the like savoring of a meal could just like light someone's senses, you know, the ways that like someone would like rub their feet together while they're like having like a bite of like oxtail and like some like rice and peas versus like, or like the way that like escabeche fish like sizzles in like the pan, all of that sensorial information, I wanted to be completely like surrounded and immersed in that. And I still feel like I am to a degree. And with organic chemistry, I think that there's a similar sort of sensory tether that like really made that like appealing, thinking about the ways in which, you can take various chemicals and put them together and like titrate and like congeal these like ingredients essentially together within like the context of like a series of beakers or like over a Bunsen burner there. And that thing can, become, say, aspirin or become cold cream, because I was thinking of specific projects we were doing during my course load, and that sort of aspect of being able to transform various disparate items into another thing that's infinitely greater than the sum of its original parts, and that can be useful or be nourishing. And those things have always really appealed to me, be it painting, be it organic chem, be it cooking, or like being a chef. Yeah, something about that like aspect of nourishment is integral to how I like want to be part of the world.
So what aspect of your practice, of the work you do as a painter, gives you those same uplifting sensations that you felt with preparing food and chemistry?
All of it, frankly. I think of my studio like it's a test kitchen, I have my pigments, I have my paints, I have my gallons of PVA and my gallons of like acrylic binder. And I get to come in here every single day and like work on paintings that are specifically informed by dishes that I'm having with my loved ones and like a lot of the like close relationships in my life. Food has always been a way for me to connect with people and be able to like share in this intimate moment and really be able to commune with people. Like I love to like have conversations or like, check in with people while either making a meal together or just like, hitting a restaurant that like we're both interested in and like, just like savoring that moment. But yeah, there's a certain, I come from a family where we don't have any recipes. Everything is improvisational. And my painting practice is the same way where like, I start from a writing sensibility where I write about these moments that I've had with my friends and loved ones. And I'll write a few notes down. There might be a few lines of like poetry or like a bit of prose or like these little vignettes. And that'll usually maybe inspire 3 to 5 colors that like I'll start working out the painting with. And as I lay down color and start thinking about space, the painting will start telling me what else I need to add to it. And so it becomes this dance and this sort of give and take back and forth with the paintings where I'm after this sort of formal qualities that I'm interested in, good space, good texture, good color. And while simultaneously trying to pay homage and pay reverence to these really intimate moments that I'm having with people. And it can be intimate positively, intimate in ways that are a bit more tenuous. But food has always been like the way that I'm able to express my connection to people. And just being able to sort of experiment and like work intuitively in the studio, just like I'd be taking out various disparate ingredients, the things that might be like left over in the fridge to like make a meal on like a Thursday night. There's a lot of kinship between those processes for me.
And when do you know a work is finished?
Quite simply, I like feel it in my gut, like I've always been like a very anxious person. And so like as a kid, I used to have like these real sort of like tingly stomach aches whenever like things felt like uncomfortable or like kind of out of place. To the opposite end of that, when things feel like really clear and feel really resolved in my life, there's a certain ease that I feel like within like the sort of core of my being that lets me know that something is finished. So the paintings, they're usually like made between like 1 to 3 sessions, and like I'm working back into the surfaces over and over. But there'll be a moment where like, I'm pulling a painting off the floor and I pin it up to the wall, and I take my steps back. And when I see the work on the wall, I'll just know. And that moment of connection, that moment of clarity is really critical for me. And something that I've had to like take these years to really attune myself to, like knowing within myself, like physically, that like the painting is done, and to know what that like translates to formally and like visually on the surface.
And when does the title enter the creative process?
So the titling is a two-pronged facet. There's a certain aspect where I like, as an abstract painter, to be didactic in the way that like I set up the reference points and the ways that I want people to start engaging with the work. So every single painting is titled after the dishes that served as the impetus to make the work. And so I love that sort of disconnect and sort of like neural sort of pathing that has to happen for a person to relate an abstract piece to a dish that they may or may not have ever had in their life. One of the things that's really exciting to me is for a person who might have seen my paintings and see the title is, say, cook up rice with gungo peas, for them to see a dish like that, and then for me to get a DM, say 6 months after an exhibition, and for that person to be like, I finally had that dish, and I completely understand this painting in a new way now. And for there to be these sort of delayed sort of relationships that can be formed, or these sort of pathings to like connections that people might have with a dish that are completely different from my own connections to them, but are still just as rich and serve to color the ways that people are perceiving the work over a longer period of time than them just like looking at the paintings in, the 20 minutes, half an hour that they might be in a gallery space, But more recently, in a sort of extension of my writing practice, I've been more intentional about writing longer titles that hints at the sort of emotionality or the emotional ambiance, as I'd like to put it, of the moments where these dishes are being consumed or being like shared in. And that also nod to the writing, the poetry, the prose that I'm working on alongside my painting practice. So having that dual pronged, like double-sided aspect of like titling has become really vital for me in terms of allowing my interest in the ways that like words can be evocative in a way that is independent and unique from the ways that a painting can be evocative. Having that balancing act, or like playing with that balancing act, is something that I'm really into.
There's a question I often ask, and that is, are there concepts or thought that connect your work? Would you say it's food?
I would say that it's food for sure. I would say that that's the foundational point, If we think about my practice as though it's a building or like an architectural structure, that definitely is, the concrete and all of the mortar and rebar upon which everything else is built. By extension, I would say that it's about the ways that like I relate to the world around me, the way that I relate to people, the way that I relate to other cultures as well. I'm Jamaican, but, I was also born in the States. I grew up in Crown Heights and I lived there my whole life. So in a lot of ways that served as my reference point to Caribbean culture, to Caribbean cuisine. But it's also that thing of like, living in the 5 boroughs, I can just as easily go down the road to like Sheepshead Bay and like have like linguine fra diavolo, or I can go uptown to like Harlem and go to like, Amy Ruth's and like eat soul food that is completely different to like what I would consider soul food in my household. And like all of those different, connections for me serve as a way for me to map the way that I move through the world and map the connections that I'm able to have with people when I'm sharing in those meals with them. I refer to my like practice as me building like a visual patois, partially because, growing up in my household, I was the first person in my family born in the States, and my folks were like very particular about me not really speaking patois too much in the house. But for me, food has always been my like tether to Jamaican culture and my tether to my like family and like the ways that I look at my relationships to like care and intimacy and connection. And so that search for connection isn't limited to what's happening in the household. And so when I get to step out of the home and like be able to be out in the world, both in New York City and abroad, because, you know, my practices has allowed me to travel to Budapest or to like Colorado or to say Michigan, frankly, or even like Berlin, you know. These are places that have their own like food histories, their own food cultures, and I get to be able to engage in those things, and they serve as like vignettes. The works that I make in those places serve as vignettes of the time that I spend there, and like I think in some ways reassert my own sort of existence in the world. I think being able to use food and like I think food has become a really integral avenue for me to reassert my own sort of presence within this world. And I think that feels really poignant and empowering to do from day to day.
Do you feel Black art can be defined?
Ooh, that's a tricky question. I would say I don't think that Black art can be sort of universally defined. There are moments when like I have clear connections with other Black artists through sort of the visual cultural reference points that they're sharing within their work, within their practices. But I don't think that necessarily means that that'll happen with every single artist. There are so many different like enclaves of Blackness within the diaspora, within the continent, that from like location to location, there are always going to be all of these various nuances and different cultural touchstones that serve to modulate our relationship to what Blackness is. And so how I like to think about it is there isn't a sort of centralized sort of notion of Blackness or like Black art or Black aesthetics, but I think that there are these nodules and like nodes of relation that crisscross and interweave, and they might not always necessarily overlap with every other sort of like facet of Blackness, but we can always draw a through line from point to point to point by one means or another.
Share with us, what are you excited about right now?
So right now, I'm excited about my solo exhibition, Rukin, that's up at Klaus von Nichtssagend Gallery in New York City. This exhibition is really exciting for me because it's the culmination of my time at the Sharpe-Walentas Studio Program. And this body of work reflects a fairly large material shift in terms of my practice. Prior to this, I'd been working largely with oil pastel on paper specifically that were collaged and shingled together and then heavily grommeted to lock those shingles of paper together. But now I'm making larger scale paintings that are made with acrylic on a material called Evalon, which is a polyester nylon microfiber. And it's been exciting to work on these because I can get my full body into the process. You know, I'm working on the floor with these long sheets of this microfiber that are sopping wet. And I'm just able to like cast paint across the surfaces. I'm running mops across them to build large swaths of color. You know, I can pop a squat or like kneel over the painting and like drag a brush across and make a 7-foot mark. And then there's this sort of give and take that is in the practice right now that I'm like really enticed by, which is rooted in the drying process. So the paintings take about 2 days to dry. And as that happens, the pigment starts to erode and shift across the surface, and it creates these new gradations and new textural marks that I can't necessarily fully control. So as I'm going through painting session to session, I'm having to play this game of like give and take with the work in terms of like what I'm intending for the surface to be, while also understanding that it's going to become something else when I'm not looking at it, and then having to build up the color such to respond to what's happening on the surfaces, and ultimately trying to find this middle ground that, like I had said before, pays homage to the moments and the vignettes that are serving as the sort of guidepost for the creation of these meals, but also still formally tantalizing painting, something that has really good color, good space, good texture, something that demands a slow read, something that I want people to be able to sink their teeth into quite literally, or not quite literally, actually. Don't bite my paintings if you go to the exhibition, people. But more metaphorically, I want people to, slow down when they see the work and like really get to savor it as though they were like at their like dining table.
I've really enjoyed our conversation. And this is the last question. What do you feel is the purpose of art? And as an artist, what is your role?
As an artist, I think about the legacy of the artists who have come before me. I think about myself as being like a descendant of like the lineage of like Howardina Pindell, of like Al Loving, of Frank Bowling, Ed Clark, Stanley Whitney. These are people who I consider in my sort of Mount Olympus of painters who I want to aspire to be like, to be able to emulate. I want to be able to be a node in someone else's lineage in the 20, 40 years that follow us in this moment right now, in the century that follows us, I want to be able to make work that's honest and like speaks to the moments that I have with people, and that like my practice can in some ways be a diaristic view into what was going on in the world in this moment in time. I want to be an artist that, other, first generation, like kids and immigrants like myself can look to and like see themselves in, and to see themselves as artists and see my practice as like a reference point for them to pursue their own interests in the arts. I want people to eat good and like think about food intensely and like really savor those moments when like they're in front of a plate of food or like with the people that they love, I want people to be more sensual in the moments that I think we take for granted. We all hopefully get to be able to have 2 to 3 meals a day. And so there are 2 to 3 moments where we can really enjoy and like be like intentional about like what we're eating, what we're consuming, what we're sharing in. I want people to be, I guess, more intimate in those moments. At the end of the day, we as human beings are just so purely like, all of our desires, all of the things that guide us through life are about seeking sensation. That's it. It's like, if we don't take the time to enjoy those things, it's like life is just bland. Life is gray.
Thank you so much. This has been great. Love your answers. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for your time. It's really been such a pleasure, such an honor to be able to like have this exchange with you. It felt really good to like talk about the work, and like I really appreciate all of your questions. It made me take some time to also like think about my practice, even though it's a fairly young practice, think about it in its totality so far. And like it brought some new connections from start to now, which is what, like 7-8 years, really. I really appreciate the sort of pondering that like this stimulated in me. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Cerebral Women Art Talks podcast. For additional content, please visit cerebralwomen.com and be sure to follow Cerebral Women on Instagram.